The night everything changed, I was standing in my backyard repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a storm. At 72 years old, I still preferred fixing things with my own hands instead of paying someone else to do it. The wood was damp, the air smelled like rain, and I remember thinking how peaceful my life should have felt after 48 years of marriage. Instead, I felt like a stranger in my own family. My name is Theodore Whitaker, and for more than a decade, the people I loved most had been slowly teaching me a painful lesson. Respect can disappear long before love does. My wife Eleanor used to look at me with admiration. At least I thought she did. But somewhere along the way, that look changed. It became disappointment first, then impatience, and finally, something much worse, contempt. The first time I truly noticed it was during a family dinner 3 years earlier. My son Brandon was talking about a wealthy businessman named Damian Mercer. Everyone at the table seemed impressed. Eleanor smiled more during those 10 minutes than she had smiled at me in months. Then she looked at me and said, "Some men keep growing no matter their age. Others become comfortable being ordinary." Everyone laughed except me. I laughed too because that's what husbands do when they don't want their families to see they're bleeding inside. After that night, comments like that became normal. Brandon started treating me like an old man whose opinions no longer mattered. My daughter Vanessa wasn't cruel, but she rarely defended me. The silence hurt almost as much as the insults. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering felt like another reminder that I had somehow become the least important person in my own home. What none of them knew was that I had started keeping records. Every insult, every lie, every suspicious conversation, every strange financial decision. 12 years earlier, I bought a small leather notebook and began writing things down. At first, it was just a way to clear my head. Later, it became evidence. I didn't know exactly what I was collecting evidence for. I only knew something was wrong, very wrong. A few months before the storm, Eleanor started mentioning Damian Mercer almost every day. She talked about his success, his charity work, his expensive vacations, and his intelligence. She compared him to politicians, celebrities, and eventually to me. "Damian understands how the world works," she said one evening while we were drinking wine on the patio. "He's built something meaningful." I stared into my glass and asked quietly, "And I haven't?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence said everything. What bothered me wasn't jealousy. At my age, jealousy feels exhausting. What bothered me was the look in her eyes whenever she talked about him. It was the same look she used to give me many years ago. Then, one Saturday afternoon, Damian appeared at a family barbecue. Nobody had warned me he was coming. Brandon welcomed him like a celebrity. Vanessa hugged him. Eleanor practically glowed when he stepped into the yard. He shook my hand and introduced himself as if we had never met before. The moment I heard his name and saw his face clearly, a memory from 25 years earlier hit me like a truck. Damian Mercer. I knew exactly who he was. Back then, he wasn't a successful businessman. He was a junior executive working for a company under my control. He had been fired after an internal investigation uncovered financial misconduct. Not enough for prison, but enough to destroy a career. Apparently, he had rebuilt his life. What shocked me was that he didn't recognize me at all. Maybe age had changed my appearance. Maybe he had never paid attention to the quiet owner behind the scenes. Either way, I realized something important that day. Damian had no idea who I really was. And for the first time in years, I decided not to correct someone who underestimated me. As the afternoon continued, I watched him carefully. He wasn't interested in our family. He wasn't interested in friendship. He was interested in influence. Every conversation felt calculated. Every compliment had a purpose. Every smile seemed rehearsed. When I mentioned it to Eleanor later that night, she became furious. "You're just threatened by him," she snapped. "Not everyone is out to get you, Theodore." I apologized because arguing wasn't worth it anymore. But as she walked away, my eyes landed on her phone sitting on the kitchen counter. A message appeared on the screen before it locked. I only saw a few words. Yet those few words changed everything. The message was from Damian, and it didn't sound like a message sent to a married woman. That was the moment I stopped wondering whether something was wrong. That was the moment I knew. I just didn't realize how much worse the truth would become. 3 days later, a woman named Gloria called me and whispered 6 words that would destroy my family forever. "They've started moving against you." Gloria had worked for my family for almost 30 years. Officially, she was retired. Unofficially, she still knew more about what happened around me than anyone else. She had started as an assistant when my company was still small and remained loyal long after she no longer needed the paycheck. Gloria wasn't the kind of woman who called people in the middle of the night. If she said something was wrong, I listened. The morning after her phone call, I drove to a small diner on the edge of town where she asked to meet. Rainwater still covered parts of the parking lot from the storm, and Gloria was already sitting in a booth when I arrived. She looked nervous. Not frightened, but nervous enough to keep checking the entrance every few seconds. That alone put me on edge. "What's going on?" I asked after sitting down. Gloria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid a manila envelope across the table. "Open it," she said quietly. Inside were copies of legal documents. I recognized my name instantly. The first page carried the heading of a law firm I had never heard of. The second page was worse. It contained a preliminary guardianship assessment. I stared at the paper for several seconds before looking back up. "What is this?" Gloria leaned closer. "It's the beginning of a plan." I felt a cold sensation move through my chest. "Whose plan?" Gloria's expression answered before her words did. "Eleanor, Brandon, Vanessa, and a man named Damian Mercer." For a moment, I genuinely thought she had to be mistaken. Even after everything I had seen, some part of me still wanted to believe my family would never cross a line like that. Then Gloria pulled out another folder. This one contained meeting schedules, appointment confirmations, and email records. Someone had been preparing a legal case designed to prove that I was no longer mentally competent to manage my affairs. According to the documents, I had become forgetful, unstable, and vulnerable to financial mistakes. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't aimed directly at destroying my life. "How long?" I asked. Gloria hesitated. "At least 6 months. 6 months. While I sat across dinner tables, while I celebrated birthdays, while I paid bills and listened to family stories. They had been building a case against me. I continued turning pages. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. They weren't planning a divorce. A divorce would have been honest compared to this. They wanted control. Complete control. If they convinced a judge I was mentally impaired, they could manage my finances, my property, my investments, and eventually my entire life. My own signature would become meaningless. My own decisions could be ignored. I looked up from the papers and asked the question that mattered most. "How did you get these?" Gloria sighed. "One of the paralegals working on the case is the daughter of an old friend. She recognized your name. She thought something felt wrong." I sat silently for several moments. Anger wasn't the first thing I felt. Disappointment was. Deep, crushing disappointment. Because I knew my family well enough to understand something important. They weren't doing this because they thought I was sick. They were doing this because they thought I was weak. Gloria reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "There's more." Those 3 words somehow sounded even worse. She handed me several photographs. The first showed Eleanor entering a law office. The second showed Brandon leaving the same building. The third nearly made me laugh from disbelief. Damian Mercer stood beside them, smiling as if he already owned everything they hoped to take. That photograph answered a question I hadn't been able to stop asking myself. Damian wasn't some accidental outsider. He wasn't simply a wealthy friend offering advice. He was part of the operation. One of the photographs had been taken only 4 days earlier. Eleanor's hand rested lightly on Damian's arm. It wasn't the gesture of a friend. It wasn't even subtle. Looking at that image felt strangely liberating. For months I had suspected something. Now I knew. There was no uncertainty left. Gloria watched my reaction carefully. "Are you okay?" she asked. I surprised myself by smiling. "Actually, yes." She frowned. "Why?" I closed the folder and slid the documents back into the envelope. "Because now I know what game they're playing." For 12 years I had been collecting pieces of a puzzle without understanding the picture. Suddenly the image was becoming clear. The insults, the comparisons, the pressure, the strange conversations that stopped whenever I entered a room. It all fit together now. Gloria leaned forward. "What are you going to do?" I looked through the diner window at the rain-covered parking lot. Most people spend their lives assuming betrayal will come from strangers. They never imagine it arriving through their own front door. but betrayal follows rules just like everything else. And the biggest mistake traders make is believing the person they're betraying knows nothing. Nothing yet? I said. Let them keep talking. Gloria stared at me. You're not going to confront them? No. I folded the envelope carefully. Because if this is really what I think it is, they're going to get comfortable. And comfortable people make mistakes. That evening, I returned home pretending nothing had happened. Eleanor greeted me with a smile that looked more practiced than genuine. Brandon called later, asking whether I had considered simplifying my finances because retirement could be confusing at my age. Vanessa suggested that maybe I should start thinking about assisted living communities in the future. Every word sounded different now. Every sentence carried hidden meaning. They weren't preparing for my future. They were preparing to take it from me. Then, 2 nights later, I woke up thirsty around midnight and walked downstairs for a glass of water. As I passed through the kitchen, I noticed a faint light coming from the dining room. Eleanor was sitting alone at the table. She wasn't aware I was watching. She was texting someone. Seconds later, her phone lit up with a reply. I couldn't see the message, but I could see the name at the top of the screen. Damien. Then Eleanor smiled in a way I hadn't seen her smile at me in years. I didn't sleep much after seeing Damien's name on Eleanor's phone, not because I was shocked anymore, but because something had changed inside me. For years I had been searching for explanations. Now I was searching for proof. The next morning, Eleanor acted as though nothing had happened. She made coffee, asked me whether I planned to finish repairing the fence, and kissed my cheek before leaving the kitchen. To anyone watching, we looked like a normal married couple. But normal marriages don't require secret meetings with lawyers. Normal marriages don't involve plans to strip one spouse of legal control over his own life. Most importantly, normal marriages don't involve another man waiting in the shadows. After breakfast, I walked into my study and unlocked the bottom drawer of an old filing cabinet. Inside sat 12 leather notebooks, one for each year, every observation, every unusual conversation, every strange financial decision, every moment that didn't make sense at the time. I placed them on the desk and began reading. Looking back through those pages felt like watching a slow-motion train wreck. The signs had been there for years. I simply hadn't wanted to see them. 5 years earlier, Eleanor suddenly became interested in my investments after ignoring them for decades. 4 years earlier, Brandon started asking detailed questions about property ownership and inheritance law. 3 years earlier, Vanessa suggested simplifying my estate planning because older people often make mistakes. At the time, each conversation seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern, and patterns never lie. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Brandon. "Hey, Dad," he said cheerfully. "How are you feeling today?" The question sounded innocent, but after seeing those guardianship documents, I heard something different. He wasn't asking how I felt. He was checking whether I sounded confused. "I'm fine," I answered. "Why?" "No reason. Just making sure you're doing okay." Then he casually mentioned a financial advisor he wanted me to meet, someone who specialized in helping seniors manage their assets. Another piece of the puzzle, another note for the notebook. Later that afternoon, I received something even more interesting. Gloria sent me copies of emails recovered from one of the law firm's internal servers. Most were routine. One wasn't. The email came from Damien. In it, he discussed projected asset values, property transfers, and timelines. He spoke as though my estate already belonged to them. One sentence caught my attention immediately. "Theodore is more isolated than ever. Once the competency review is complete, the rest should move quickly." I read that sentence 5 times, not because it surprised me, because it revealed how they saw me. They didn't see a husband. They didn't see a father. They didn't even see a human being. They saw an obstacle standing between them and money. That evening, Eleanor announced we would be hosting a small family dinner that weekend. Brandon and Vanessa would attend. So would Damien. I agreed immediately. Eleanor seemed relieved. She probably assumed I remained completely unaware of what was happening around me. The truth was exactly the opposite. For the first time in years, I was paying attention to everything. Saturday arrived. By 6 o'clock, everyone had gathered around the dining table. Brandon told stories about business opportunities. Vanessa discussed real estate trends. Damien talked about investments and luxury travel. Eleanor laughed at all the right moments. Then Damien made a mistake, a small one, but sometimes small mistakes reveal enormous truths. He began telling a story about a corporate fraud investigation from decades earlier. According to him, a dishonest executive had ruined his early career. As he spoke, I watched his face carefully. The details were wrong, deliberately wrong. He wasn't describing an injustice. He was rewriting history. Because I remembered that investigation perfectly. I remembered the missing money. I remembered the forged documents. Most importantly, I remembered signing the termination papers myself. Damian Mercer wasn't a victim. He had been guilty. Sitting across from him now, I realized something else. He still didn't recognize me. 25 years ago, I was younger, heavier, and rarely appeared in public. Most employees never met me directly. To Damian, I was just another retired old man sitting at the end of a dinner table. That misunderstanding might become the biggest mistake of his life. The conversation continued for another hour. Damian dominated most of it. Eleanor looked at him with admiration. Brandon treated him like a mentor. Vanessa listened respectfully. Meanwhile, I quietly observed every interaction, every glance, every smile, every hidden signal passing between them. Then dessert arrived, and something happened that changed the entire game. Eleanor stood up and went into the kitchen. Damian followed less than a minute later. Nobody seemed to notice, except me. A few moments afterward, I walked toward the hallway as if looking for the restroom. As I passed the kitchen entrance, I heard Eleanor speaking softly. "Are you sure we're ready?" she asked. Damian answered immediately. "The sooner we move, the better." "He's already exactly where we need him." I froze. Then Eleanor asked a question that made my blood run cold. "And once we have control, what happens next?" There was a short silence. Then Damian laughed. "After that, Theodore won't be a problem anymore." I stood in the hallway outside my own kitchen, while Damian Mercer's words settled into my chest like ice. After that, Theodore won't be a problem anymore. There are sentences a man hears only once and remembers for the rest of his life. That was one of them. I did not move. I did not breathe loudly. I simply stood there with one hand resting against the wall, listening to my wife and her lover discuss my future, as if I were already gone. Eleanor's voice came next, quieter now. "I don't want anything messy." Damian gave a soft laugh. "Nothing messy. That's the whole point of doing it legally." Legally. That word almost made me smile. People like Damian loved that word. They used it the way thieves used gloves, to make something dirty look clean. "The assessment comes first," he continued, "then the power of attorney, then the facility. Once he is placed somewhere stable, nobody will question the asset transition." My pulse stayed steady, but something in me shifted permanently. Until that moment, a part of me had still been searching for mercy inside Eleanor. I had wanted to believe she was confused, manipulated, embarrassed by old resentments, maybe even trapped by Damian's charm. But the way she stood there listening to him describe moving me into a facility told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't trapped. She was participating. I stepped back from the kitchen doorway before they could notice me and returned to the dining room. Brandon was scrolling through his phone. Vanessa was taking a picture of the dessert Eleanor had ordered from a bakery and pretended to make herself. Neither of them looked up. That used to hurt me. That night, it helped me. Invisible men hear things visible men never would. I sat down, lifted my coffee cup, and waited. When Eleanor and Damian returned, they were smiling. Damian even clapped a hand on my shoulder as he passed behind my chair. "Theodore," he said warmly, "you have a beautiful home." I looked up at him and smiled just enough. I've always thought so. He didn't understand what I meant. None of them did. After everyone left, I went into my study, locked the door, and opened the newest notebook. I wrote the date, the time, and every word I had heard in the kitchen. I wrote carefully, without emotion, because emotion could be challenged later. Facts could not. Then I called Catherine Lowell, my trust and estate attorney. Catherine had represented me for nearly 30 years. She was one of the few people alive who knew the full structure of my holdings. When she answered, I didn't waste time. "They have a competency assessment planned," I said. There was no surprise in her voice, only focus. "How soon?" "Soon." Damian said the assessment comes first. Catherine was quiet for a second. "Then we move now." "No," I said. "Not yet." She exhaled sharply. "Theodore, I need them to expose the full plan. You already have enough to stop them. Stopping them isn't enough. I looked at the notebook lying open on my desk. If I stop them now, they call it a misunderstanding. They say I misheard. They say I'm paranoid. They say Damien was only advising my family. They retreat, regroup, and try again later. Catherine didn't answer immediately because she knew I was right. "What do you want?" she asked. "A clean medical evaluation. Independent. Certified. Something no fake physician can challenge. I can arrange that. And I want every document they draft copied, preserved, and reviewed." Catherine's voice lowered. "That may take cooperation from inside the law office." Gloria already has a line. Another silence followed. This time Catherine sounded more concerned. "Be careful with Gloria. If they realize she's involved, they'll pressure her." "They won't." "You sound very sure." I looked toward the hallway where Eleanor had walked only minutes earlier, wearing the same wedding ring I had placed on her finger decades ago. "I'm sure because they still think I'm stupid." The next morning, Gloria arrived at the back door with a container of soup and a face that told me she had not slept much either. Eleanor was upstairs, so I let Gloria in through the kitchen. She placed the soup on the counter and immediately handed me a folded note. "They have an appointment next Wednesday," she whispered. "A doctor?" I asked. She nodded. "Dr. Leonard Voss, private clinic. No hospital affiliation I can find. He has handled guardianship evaluations before." I opened the note. There were names, dates, office addresses, and one sentence written at the bottom in Gloria's firm handwriting. "They are trying to make you look confused before the exam." I looked up. "What does that mean?" Gloria's eyes moved toward the ceiling, then back to me. "Eleanor has been asking about your memory. Brandon called me yesterday and asked whether you had been repeating yourself. Vanessa asked one of the neighbors if you'd been wandering outside at night." I felt no shock this time, only confirmation. They were building witnesses, not truth. Witnesses. "Anything else?" Gloria hesitated. That hesitation told me I wasn't going to like the answer. "Eleanor bought something from a pharmacy 3 weeks ago. Not a regular pharmacy, a compounding pharmacy." My hand tightened around the note. "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but she paid cash. For the first time that morning, anger moved through me hot and fast. I controlled it before it reached my face. "Find out what it was." Gloria nodded. "I already asked." She turned to leave, then stopped near the door. "Theodore, listen to me. These people are not just trying to embarrass you. They are trying to erase you." I stood in my kitchen, hearing the furnace hum, smelling the soup she had brought, staring at the woman who had been more loyal to me than my own family. "I know," I said. "Then act like you know." After she left, I stood alone for a long moment. Then I did something I had avoided for years. I walked upstairs, opened the safe hidden behind the cedar panel in my closet, and removed a sealed file marked Mercer. Inside were the documents from 25 years ago. Internal audit reports, transfer records, termination papers, and the original memo proving Damien Mercer had stolen from one of my companies before he ever became the charming man my wife admired. I spread the pages across the bed and stared at them. Damien thought he had entered my life by accident. He hadn't. Men like him followed money the way wolves followed blood. Maybe he didn't recognize me yet, but something had led him back into my orbit. A name, a whisper, a rumor about assets hidden behind an ordinary suburban life. By noon, Catherine called back. "Your independent medical evaluation is scheduled for Monday morning. Full cognitive battery. Certified report. Sealed copy to my office." "Good. Theodore," she said, "there is something else." I closed the Mercer file. "What?" "If they succeed in getting even temporary guardianship, undoing it could take months." I looked through the bedroom window at the yard where I had spent years fixing fences, planting tomatoes, pretending peace could survive without honesty. "Then we make sure they fail publicly." That evening, Eleanor brought me a glass of scotch in my favorite tumbler. She smiled softly and said, "You look tired. This will help you sleep." I looked at the amber liquid in the glass, then at her face. For the first time in our marriage, I wondered whether my wife was only trying to make me look confused or whether she was willing to make sure I never woke up clear again. I stared at the glass of scotch in Eleanor's hand for several seconds before accepting it. She smiled the same way she always had when offering me a drink after a long day, but now every familiar gesture felt different. Suspicion changes everything. It transforms ordinary moments into questions and simple kindness into potential danger. "You should relax," she said softly. "You've seemed stressed lately." Stressed. That word almost made me laugh. My wife was helping organize a legal coup against me. My children were preparing to strip away my independence. And the man sleeping with my wife was quietly positioning himself to benefit from everything I had spent a lifetime building. Stress seemed like an understatement. "Maybe you're right," I replied. Eleanor kissed my cheek and left the room. The second I heard her footsteps disappear down the hallway, I carried the drink into my bathroom and poured it into a sterile sample container I had purchased earlier that afternoon. Then I sealed it, labeled it with the date and time, and placed it inside a cooler. If Gloria's suspicions were correct, I wanted proof. Real proof. Not theories, not accusations. Evidence. The following Monday, I attended the independent medical evaluation Catherine had arranged. The examination lasted nearly 4 hours. Memory tests, cognitive exercises, problem-solving assessments, financial reasoning evaluations, neurological screening. By the time I finished, I was exhausted. 2 days later, Catherine called with the results. "Perfect," she said. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means you scored above average in every category. The doctor specifically noted that your cognitive performance is exceptional for someone your age." I leaned back in my chair. "Good. There's more." Her voice carried a hint of satisfaction. The physician also stated there are absolutely no signs of dementia, confusion, impairment, or diminished capacity. Exactly what I needed. If Damien and Eleanor planned to paint me as mentally incompetent, they were about to run into a wall built from facts. That afternoon, Gloria called again. I found out what Eleanor bought. I immediately closed my office door. "Tell me." "A sedative." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. "Are you sure?" I finally asked. "Positive. It wasn't enough to kill someone. It wasn't even illegal. But taken regularly, it could cause fatigue, memory problems, confusion, and slower reaction times." I felt a cold anger settle inside me. The worst part wasn't the drug itself. The worst part was how carefully it had been chosen. Whoever planned this understood exactly what symptoms would support a guardianship case. "Can you prove she purchased it?" I asked. "Yes." "Can you prove it was administered?" Gloria hesitated. "Not yet." I looked toward the kitchen downstairs, where Eleanor spent most mornings preparing breakfast. "Then, we keep looking." 2 nights later, I got the proof. It happened completely by accident. Eleanor attended a charity dinner with Damien, leaving me alone in the house. Around 9 o'clock, I walked into the kitchen to make coffee. While searching for filters, I noticed a small bottle hidden behind several spice containers. It wasn't a place anyone would normally look. Curiosity made me pick it up. The label had been removed, but inside were capsules matching the description Gloria had given me. I immediately photographed everything. Then I sealed the bottle inside an evidence bag Catherine had provided. For the first time, I held physical proof in my hands. Someone inside my home had been secretly administering medication to me. I didn't know how long it had been happening, but I knew exactly who had access to my food and drinks. Later that evening, Catherine reviewed the photographs. "This changes everything," she said. "Not yet. Theodore, this could be criminal. Only if we can prove intent." Catherine sighed. "You always were patient." "No," I answered quietly. "I just learned that rushing revenge often ruins justice." The next week brought another breakthrough. Charlotte requested a private meeting. We met at a quiet cafe outside town. She looked nervous enough to be physically ill. After several minutes of silence, she slid a flash drive across the table. "What's this?" I asked. "Things Brandon didn't think I would find." My stomach tightened. Charlotte explained that Brandon had been using her laptop one evening when he accidentally synced several private files to a shared cloud folder. Curious, she opened them. What she discovered changed her relationship forever. There were emails between Brandon and Damien discussing future asset transfers, spreadsheets estimating inheritance values, notes describing timelines for obtaining control of my finances. Most disturbing of all was a document titled Post-Guardianship Strategy. I opened the file immediately. Within seconds, my blood began to boil. According to the document, Once legal control had been established, Brandon expected to receive direct access to several trust accounts. Damien would receive consulting payments. Eleanor would gain authority over real estate holdings. My entire life had been divided like slices of a pie before I was even gone. Charlotte wiped tears from her eyes. "I loved him," she whispered. "I thought I was going to marry him." I looked at the young woman sitting across from me and saw something my own children had forgotten years ago. "Conscience, why are you giving this to me?" I asked. Her answer came immediately. "Because what they're doing is evil." I drove home that afternoon with the flash drive in my pocket and a growing realization in my mind. This was no longer about greed. Greedy people steal when opportunity appears. This group had spent months planning, coordinating, manipulating, and preparing. They weren't reacting to temptation. They were executing a strategy, and strategies leave footprints. That night, another family dinner took place. Eleanor laughed. Brandon smiled. Vanessa discussed vacation plans. Damien spoke confidently about future investments. Watching them felt surreal. They believed they were winning. They believed I remained blind, confused, and harmless. They had no idea that every day brought more evidence into my hands. Then Brandon made a mistake. As dinner ended, he raised his wine glass and looked directly at Damien. It lasted only a second, but the exchange was unmistakable. A private celebration, the kind people share when they think success is close. I smiled politely and raised my own glass. Inside, I made a silent promise. Let them celebrate now. Because very soon, every person sitting around that table was going to discover the difference between having a plan and underestimating the man they were trying to destroy. 3 days after Charlotte handed me the flash drive, Brandon showed up at my house carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of confidence people only have when they think they've already won. Eleanor had gone shopping that morning, which I later realized was not a coincidence. They wanted Brandon to handle this conversation alone. They believed a son could convince his father to surrender more easily than a stranger could. I invited him inside and made coffee. For a few minutes, he talked about sports, traffic, and the weather. The performance would have been impressive if I hadn't already read the documents describing exactly what he planned to do. Finally, he opened the briefcase and placed a thick stack of papers on the kitchen table. "Dad, I need you to look at something." I glanced down at the documents without touching them. Power of attorney forms, financial authorization agreements, asset management provisions. Everything had been prepared in advance. "What's all this?" I asked. Brandon sighed dramatically as if he were carrying an enormous burden. "Dad, we're worried about you." There it was, the lie they had rehearsed. The lie they probably repeated so often that they almost believed it themselves. "Worried about me?" I asked. Brandon nodded. "You've been forgetting things." "Such as?" He hesitated. "Little things." I waited. He couldn't name a single example, because there weren't any. "Everyone gets older," he continued. "There's nothing wrong with getting help." I looked at my son and wondered when greed had become stronger than love. Maybe it hadn't happened all at once. Maybe it had happened one compromise at a time until he no longer recognized himself. "So you want me to sign these?" I asked. His face brightened slightly. "It would make everything easier. Easier. Not safer. Not better. Easier. For them." I picked up the first page and pretended to read it carefully. The truth was that I already knew what every document contained. One signature would give Brandon authority over decisions that belonged to me. Another would allow financial oversight. Another would create pathways toward guardianship. It was a trap hidden beneath legal language. "No," I said calmly. The smile disappeared from Brandon's face. "What?" I said no. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I watched frustration replace confidence. "Dad, you're being stubborn. Maybe. This isn't about money." The lie came so quickly that it almost impressed me. "Then why is every page about money?" His jaw tightened. "Because someone has to protect what's left." What's left? The words hit me harder than they should have. Not because they were cruel, but because they revealed exactly how he saw me. In Brandon's mind, I was already disappearing. Not a father, not a person, just an aging obstacle standing between him and an inheritance. Then he made a mistake. A huge mistake. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "sometimes I think Mom deserved someone more ambitious." The room became very quiet. "What did you say?" Brandon shrugged. "I'm just being honest. Honest. That word again. People always call cruelty honesty when they don't want to feel guilty. Damien built something. He took risks. He created success. People respect him." I stared at my son across the table. "And you don't respect me?" It wasn't a question. Brandon didn't answer immediately. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it told me everything. Finally, he looked away. "I just think Mom spent years settling. Settling. 48 years of marriage reduced to a single word. I felt pain then. Real pain. Not anger. Not disappointment. Pain. Because no matter how much evidence I collected, no matter how many lies I uncovered, part of me still remembered teaching Brandon how to ride a bicycle. I remembered carrying him on my shoulders. I remembered working late nights to pay for schools, vacations, and opportunities I never had myself. Yet here he sat, comparing me to the man sleeping with my wife. "We're done here," I said quietly. Brandon stood up immediately. "You're making a mistake. Maybe. When this gets worse, don't say nobody tried to help you." I almost laughed. "Help me. The people trying to steal my life were calling themselves helpers." Brandon stuffed the documents back into his briefcase and headed toward the front door. Before leaving, he stopped and turned around. "You know what's sad?" he asked. "What? If you had been more like Damien, none of this would be happening." Then he walked out. I remained at the kitchen table for a long time after he left. Not because I was shocked, not because I was confused, because for the first time, I accepted a truth I had been avoiding. My son wasn't being manipulated. He wasn't making mistakes. He wasn't lost. Brandon knew exactly what he was doing, and he had chosen his side. That evening, Charlotte called me crying. What she told me next would destroy any remaining doubt about the kind of man Brandon had become. Charlotte called just after 8 that evening. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She wasn't crying loudly. It was worse than that. She sounded like someone trying desperately not to cry at all. "Can we meet?" she asked. "Tonight." 30 minutes later, I found her sitting alone in her car outside a small park near the lake. The parking lot was nearly empty. When I opened the passenger door, I immediately noticed her engagement ring sitting on the center console. My eyes moved from the ring to her face. She looked exhausted. "What happened?" I asked quietly. Charlotte stared through the windshield for several seconds before answering. "Brandon knows someone is leaking information." My stomach tightened. "Does he know it's you?" "Not yet." She swallowed hard. "But he's getting close." Then she handed me her phone. An audio recording was paused on the screen. "Listen." I pressed play. Brandon's voice filled the car. At first, he sounded relaxed. Then Damien's voice joined the conversation. They were sitting in a restaurant discussing future plans. What shocked me wasn't the conversation itself. It was how casually they talked about other people. Charlotte, Eleanor, Vanessa, even me. To Brandon, everyone was simply a piece on a board. "Once everything transfers, Charlotte becomes unnecessary," Brandon said. My grip tightened around the phone. Damien laughed. "You still planning to marry her?" "Maybe." Brandon took a sip of something before continuing. "Depends how useful her family's connections remain." The recording continued. Every second made him sound worse. Charlotte stared ahead while I listened. She had clearly already heard the entire thing. "How did you get this?" I asked. He left his phone connected to my tablet. Her voice cracked slightly. "I wasn't trying to spy. It just synced automatically." I resumed the recording. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "My father thinks people respect him because he's honest," Brandon said. "The truth is nobody respects him. They just feel sorry for him." For a moment, I simply stared at the dark screen after the recording ended. Not because the words surprised me, because hearing them spoken aloud felt different. The man talking wasn't a confused son making mistakes. He wasn't being manipulated by Damien. He wasn't trapped by circumstances. He genuinely believed those things. Charlotte wiped tears from her face. "I loved him." I nodded slowly. "I know." I thought I knew who he was. I looked at the engagement ring sitting between us. "Most people don't discover the truth until after the wedding." She laughed bitterly. "That doesn't make me feel better." "It shouldn't." We sat quietly for a while. Then Charlotte turned toward me. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why aren't you angry?" I almost smiled. Who says I'm not? Because every time I bring you evidence, you stay calm. I look through the windshield at the empty park. When I was younger, I thought anger made people stronger. I paused. Now I know anger usually makes people careless. Charlotte studied me for a moment. You're planning something. No, I shook my head. I'm waiting for them to finish planning something. For the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared on her face. The next day happened to be my granddaughter Emma's 10th birthday. The family gathered at Brandon's house for a celebration. I almost didn't go, but avoiding them would have raised questions. So I arrived carrying a gift and a smile that took more effort than anyone realized. Emma ran into my arms the moment I walked through the door. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Children laughed, balloons floated near the ceiling, cake sat on the dining table. Then Damien arrived. He wasn't family, yet somehow he walked into the house as if he belonged there. Eleanor greeted him with a hug that lasted slightly too long. Brandon handed him a drink before offering one to me. Small details, small humiliations, the kind people ignore unless they happen repeatedly for years. During dinner, the conversation turned toward success. Brandon started praising Damien's business achievements. Vanessa joined in. Eleanor looked proud. Then Brandon made another mistake. Damien understands how to build something from nothing, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. That's why people look up to him. He glanced toward me. The look lasted only a second, but everyone at the table understood the comparison. A few guests looked uncomfortable. Nobody spoke. Then Emma asked an innocent question. "Grandpa, what did you do before you retired?" The room became strangely quiet. Before I could answer, Brandon laughed. Mostly paperwork. Several people chuckled politely. Damien smiled into his wine glass. Eleanor didn't say a word. Not one. My granddaughter waited for an answer. I looked into her eyes and smiled. "I built a few things," I said. "Nothing exciting." Emma seemed satisfied. Brandon looked relieved. The conversation moved on. But something happened inside me during those few seconds. Not anger. Clarity. Complete clarity. I finally understood why they underestimated me so badly. Because I had spent years allowing them to. I had hidden my accomplishments. I had avoided attention. I had chosen simplicity over recognition. In trying to protect my family from the influence of wealth, I had accidentally taught them that I possessed none. Later that night, after most guests had left, I stepped outside onto the back patio alone. The summer air felt warm against my skin. A few minutes later, Charlotte quietly joined me. "I ended it," she whispered. "With Brandon?" She nodded. "An hour ago." I looked at her. "How did he take it?" A sad smile crossed her face. "He asked whether I planned to tell anyone what I know. That answer told me everything. He wasn't heartbroken. He wasn't sorry. He was worried." Charlotte stared into the darkness beyond the yard. "Theodore." "Yes? I don't think they're planning to wait much longer." Before I could respond, the patio door opened. Brandon stepped outside. The look on his face told me he had just learned about the broken engagement, and judging by the anger in his eyes, someone was finally starting to lose control. Brandon stood in the patio doorway, with one hand gripping the frame so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. For a moment, nobody spoke. Charlotte remained beside me, her shoulders squared but her face tense. I could feel how much courage it took for her not to step back. Brandon looked at her first, then at me, and the anger in his eyes became something sharper. Suspicion. "What is this?" he asked. Charlotte answered before I could. "A conversation." Brandon laughed once, cold and humorless. "With him?" The word him carried more contempt than most insults. I watched Charlotte flinch, but she recovered quickly. "Yes, Brandon, with your father." He stepped onto the patio and closed the door behind him. "Interesting, because a few hours after you break off our engagement, I find you out here whispering with my father like you've both been planning something." Charlotte lifted her chin. "Maybe you should ask yourself why people feel safer telling him the truth than telling you anything at all." That hit him. I saw it. His mouth tightened, and for a second, the polished version of Brandon disappeared. What remained was the boy who hated being exposed. "Careful," he said quietly. Charlotte's eyes flashed. "Or what?" Brandon looked toward the house, where the last guests were still laughing inside. "You don't want to start a family war." I almost smiled at that. "A family war?" I said. Brandon turned toward me. Stay out of this, Dad. You brought it to my house. This isn't your house. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. The moment they did, the patio became completely silent. Even Brandon seemed to realize how much he had revealed. Charlotte stared at him. I did not move. Not my house? I asked quietly. Brandon swallowed. I didn't mean it like that. But he had. Of course he had. In his mind, everything was already shifting. The house, the accounts, the decision-making, my life. He didn't think of these things as mine anymore. He thought of them as future assets waiting for transfer. Then how did you mean it? I asked. Brandon looked away. You're twisting my words. Charlotte spoke softly. No. For once, someone heard them clearly. That was when Brandon made his next mistake. He stepped closer to her. Not enough to touch her. Not enough to threaten her in a way someone else could easily describe, but enough to remind her of the difference in size, confidence, and cruelty. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing, he said. Because if you start spreading lies, I promise you, people will find out things about your family too. Charlotte went still. I saw fear pass over her face, not because she believed him, but because she understood exactly what kind of man he had become. Are you threatening me? She asked. Brandon smiled. I'm advising you. I set my glass down on the patio table. The sound was small, but both of them looked at me. That's enough. Brandon scoffed. What are you going to do? There it was again. The assumption beneath every cruel thing he had said for years. What are you going to do? As if age erased power, as if quiet meant helpless, as if patience meant weakness. I looked at my son and said, more than you think. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. Then he laughed, because men like Brandon always laugh when they're scared of questions they don't want to answer. You know, Mom was right, he said. You've gotten strange lately. Charlotte looked horrified. I remained calm. Strange how? Secretive, paranoid, forgetful. He pointed toward the house. Everyone sees it. Everyone. That word was deliberate. Not I see it, not Mom sees it. Everyone. He was building the record right there on my son's patio, in front of the woman he had just lost. You should talk to someone, he continued. A professional. I nodded slowly. Maybe I already have. His expression changed again. This time, not anger. Concern. Real concern. Not for me. For himself. What does that mean? It means I'm listening more carefully than I used to. Charlotte looked at me then, and I saw understanding dawn across her face. She realized I had not come to the birthday party unprepared. I had come to watch, to confirm, to let Brandon speak, and he had spoken beautifully. Brandon stepped back, suddenly aware that he had gone further than intended. I'm done with this. He turned toward Charlotte. We'll talk tomorrow. No, she said. Her voice trembled, but she did not look away. We won't. Something in his face hardened. You're making a mistake. Charlotte picked up her engagement ring from her pocket and placed it on the patio table between them. No, I'm correcting one. Brandon stared at the ring, as if it had personally betrayed him. Then he looked at me with pure hatred. You did this. I shook my head. You did. He stormed back inside without another word. Through the glass door, I watched him re-enter the party, straighten his jacket, and put his smile back on in less than 5 seconds. That might have frightened me most of all. The speed, the control, the ability to become charming again while carrying rage underneath the surface. Charlotte exhaled shakily beside me. I'm sorry. Don't be. He knows now. Good. She looked at me. Good? I nodded. People reveal more when they feel cornered. She stared at the door where Brandon had disappeared. Then he's going to reveal a lot. The next morning, she called me again. This time, her voice was steady. I checked the shared files again. And? There's a meeting scheduled tomorrow night. My pulse slowed, not quickened. Sometimes certainty brings calm. Who? Eleanor. Brandon. Vanessa. Damien. A pause. And someone from the facility. What facility? Charlotte swallowed. Sunrise Gardens Senior Living. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Not from surprise. From final confirmation. They weren't just planning to take my money anymore. They had already chosen where to put me after they took it. Charlotte continued, her voice lower now. The notes say they want the intake packet ready before the weekend. I looked toward the fence outside my kitchen window, the same fence Eleanor had mocked me for fixing, the same fence I had kept straight while my family bent themselves around greed. "Thank you, Charlotte," I said. "What are you going to do?" I looked at the leather notebook on my desk, then at the sealed files waiting beside it. "I'm going to let them invite me to my own removal." That evening, Eleanor came home carrying takeout and wearing the soft expression she used when she wanted something. She kissed my cheek and said, "Theodore, Brandon, and Vanessa are coming over Friday night. Damien, too. We all need to have a serious family conversation." I smiled gently. "Of course." She seemed relieved. "You won't make this difficult, will you?" I looked at the woman I had loved for nearly half a century and finally saw her clearly. "No, Eleanor," I said. "I won't make it difficult at all." After Eleanor invited me to the family conversation, the atmosphere inside the house changed. It was subtle at first. Extra politeness, forced smiles, questions that sounded innocent but weren't. Eleanor asked whether I had been sleeping well. Vanessa called twice in the same week to ask if I remembered an appointment from months earlier. Brandon texted me links about retirement planning and healthy aging. They were no longer preparing their case in secret. They were rehearsing it. Every interaction felt like a performance designed for an invisible audience. What they didn't realize was that I had stopped reacting emotionally. Once you understand the game, the moves become predictable. Friday arrived with perfect weather. The sky was clear. The neighborhood was quiet. The kind of peaceful evening people imagine when they think about family gatherings. Around 6 o'clock, Brandon arrived first. He carried a bottle of expensive wine and wore the confident smile of a man who believed victory was only hours away. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later. Then Damien appeared. He parked in my driveway as if he belonged there. Watching him walk toward my front door made something very clear. He was no longer hiding his relationship with Eleanor. He didn't think he needed to. They all believed the future had already been decided. Dinner began pleasantly enough. We talked about local news, weather, and Emma's birthday party. Nobody mentioned the real reason they were there. Not yet. I watched them carefully. Brandon kept checking his phone. Vanessa seemed nervous. Damien was unusually relaxed. Eleanor looked determined. It reminded me of actors waiting backstage before a performance. Then dessert was served, and the performance finally began. Eleanor folded her hands on the table and looked directly at me. "Theodore," she said softly, "we need to discuss some important things." There it was. The script had started. I nodded politely. "Go ahead." Brandon immediately took control. "Dad, we've all been worried about you." The same opening line again. They must have practiced it. "Have you?" I asked. "Of course." Vanessa leaned forward. "We love you." Love. Funny how often people use that word right before trying to take something from you. Brandon slid a folder across the table. "We met with some professionals." I looked at the folder without opening it. Professionals? People who help families manage difficult transitions. Damien remained silent, but I noticed the small smile hiding at the corner of his mouth. He was enjoying this. "And what transition would that be?" I asked. Brandon exchanged a quick glance with Eleanor. Then he said it. "We're concerned you may not be able to manage everything by yourself anymore." There was a brief silence. I expected anger. Instead, I felt relief. After months of secrets, they were finally speaking openly. "I see." Brandon relaxed slightly. He thought I was accepting the accusation. "Nobody is saying you're incapable," he continued. "We're just saying you need support." Support. Another carefully chosen word. Vanessa joined in. "Dad, sometimes people don't realize they're struggling." I looked at my daughter. "And you think I'm struggling?" She couldn't hold my gaze. "I think you're getting older." Damien finally spoke. "There's no shame in that, Theodore." The audacity almost impressed me. A man who had built his future around stealing mine was now pretending to offer wisdom. I opened the folder. Inside were brochures, financial management programs, assisted living options, guardianship explanations. And there it was, Sunrise Gardens Senior Living, the facility Charlotte had warned me about. They had already selected the place. My future residence had been chosen before I was even asked. "You've done a lot of planning," I said. Eleanor smiled nervously. "Only because we care." Care. Another lie. I flipped through the pages slowly. The more they talked, the more confident they became. Brandon explained how much easier life would be. Vanessa described community activities. Damien discussed professional care and safety. Listening to them felt surreal. 4 intelligent adults sitting around a table pretending theft was compassion. Eventually, Brandon pushed a second folder toward me. This one was thicker. Legal documents, signature pages, authorization forms, the real purpose of the meeting. "We don't need to do everything tonight," he said, "but getting started would help." I looked around the table. 4 faces, 4 conspirators, 4 people convinced they had already won. Then something unexpected happened. My phone vibrated. Just once. A message from Catherine. Only 4 words. "Everything is ready." I felt calm immediately. Not because I planned to reveal anything tonight, because I knew the board was finally set. Every piece stood exactly where it needed to be. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned my attention to the family. Brandon mistook my silence for hesitation. "Dad?" he asked. "What are you thinking?" I looked at him, then at Vanessa, then Eleanor, finally Damien. "I'm thinking," I said slowly, "that this conversation has been a long time coming." Brandon smiled. "Then you understand." "Yes," I replied. "I think I finally do." The relief that spread across their faces was almost immediate. They believed I was surrendering. They believed all the pressure, manipulation, and deception had worked. What none of them understood was that while they spent months building a case against me, I had spent months building something much more dangerous, proof. And before this was over, every person sitting at that table was going to discover exactly how expensive betrayal could become. The moment I finished speaking, an almost invisible wave of relief moved across the table. Brandon leaned back in his chair. Vanessa relaxed her shoulders. Eleanor released a breath she probably didn't realize she had been holding. Even Damien allowed himself a small smile. They all thought the same thing. They thought I was finally giving up. For months they had been pushing, manipulating, lying, and preparing. Now they believed they were watching the final wall collapse. What they didn't understand was that the most dangerous moment in any battle comes when one side becomes too confident. Confident people stop being careful. "I'm glad we're finally on the same page," Brandon said. I looked down at the documents spread across the dining room table. There were more pages than before. Much more. The first folder had been designed to make me comfortable. This second folder contained the real objective: signature lines, legal authorizations, medical releases, asset management provisions, temporary guardianship requests. They had come prepared for victory. "Let's go through everything together," Brandon continued. "No rush." It was a lie. There was absolutely a rush. Every expression around the table revealed it. They wanted signatures tonight. They wanted control tonight. They wanted the process moving before anything unexpected could happen. I slowly opened the first document. Brandon immediately began explaining it. Not because I asked him to, because he was nervous. People talk too much when they're nervous. "This one only allows assistance with certain financial matters," he said. "Nothing major." Another lie. The authority granted by the document would allow access to accounts, property decisions, and investment management. Brandon knew that. I knew that. But everyone at the table pretended otherwise. I flipped another page, then another, then another. Every document pointed toward the same destination. Remove Theodore, transfer authority, secure assets, control the future. Eleanor reached across the table and touched my hand. For years that gesture would have comforted me. Now it felt like part of the performance. "Nobody wants to take anything from you," she said softly. I looked at her wedding ring, then at mine. Of course not. Her eyes dropped immediately. That told me more than words ever could. She couldn't even hold eye contact while lying anymore. Vanessa finally spoke. "Dad, we know this is difficult." I almost laughed. Difficult. They thought the difficult part was signing papers. The difficult part had actually happened months earlier, when I realized my own family valued my money more than my presence. Damien folded his hands together. "Theodore, sometimes strength means accepting help." The arrogance of hearing life advice from the man secretly sleeping with my wife was almost unbelievable, yet I remained calm. I had learned something important over the last few months. People reveal themselves most clearly when you stop interrupting them. So, I listened. Brandon talked. Eleanor talked. Vanessa talked. Damien talked. And the more they spoke, the uglier the truth became. Eventually, Brandon pushed one final document toward me. Unlike the others, this one wasn't hidden behind soft language. The title sat clearly across the top of the page: Sunrise Gardens Senior Living Resident Intake Authorization. I stared at the document for several seconds. Nobody spoke. The silence told me they understood what this page represented. Everything before this had been preparation. This was the destination. "You already filled out most of it," I said quietly. Brandon cleared his throat. "Only to save time. Save time. My future residents had already been selected. My personal information had already been entered. My medical history had already been summarized. All they needed was my signature." How thoughtful. Nobody responded, because for the first time all evening, they could hear the meaning beneath my words. I turned another page, then another. Then I found something interesting. An expected move-in date. 3 weeks away. 3 weeks. They had already scheduled my replacement before I was gone. I looked up from the papers. "You planned all this together?" Brandon nodded. "We're a family." That answer hurt more than he realized. Because families are supposed to protect each other, not organize removals, not prepare takeovers, not divide property while someone is still alive. Then came the moment none of them expected. I closed the folder, not aggressively, not dramatically, calmly, very calmly. Brandon immediately sat forward. "Dad?" I folded my hands together. "No." The word landed like a brick. Nobody moved. "What?" Brandon asked. "No." The second time sounded even heavier. Eleanor blinked. "Theodore." I raised a hand. "No." Brandon's face changed instantly. The patient son vanished. The caring son vanished. The worried son vanished. What remained was a man watching years of planning begin to slip away. "You're being unreasonable." "Maybe. You haven't even considered the facts." I almost smiled. The facts. If only he knew how many facts I actually possessed. Vanessa looked nervous now. "Dad, please." Damien finally entered the conversation again. "Perhaps you're reacting emotionally." That sentence nearly exposed everything. Because the people sitting around that table had spent months trying to portray me as unstable, emotional, irrational, confused. Yet I was the calmest person in the room. Brandon wasn't calm anymore. "Do you understand what happens if something goes wrong?" he demanded. "What exactly goes wrong?" I asked. "Your health." "My health is excellent." He froze. Only for a second. But I saw it. Fear. Tiny. Brief. Real. Then Eleanor made the biggest mistake of the entire evening. "You don't know that." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Everyone at the table went silent, including her. I looked directly at my wife. "I don't?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, because she suddenly realized something. She knew more about my supposed condition than she should. Much more. Brandon quickly jumped in. "Mom only means I know exactly what she means." Silence returned. Heavy silence. Dangerous silence. Then I pushed my chair back and stood up. 4 pairs of eyes followed me. Brandon looked panicked now. "Where are you going?" I picked up the folders and stacked them neatly. "To bed." "We're not finished." I looked at him. Really looked at him. The little boy I once taught to ride a bicycle was gone. In his place stood a stranger wearing my son's face. "Yes," I said quietly, "we are." Then I walked out of the dining room. Behind me, I heard angry whispers begin immediately. Brandon, Eleanor, Damien. None of them bothering to hide their frustration anymore. They thought the meeting had failed. What they didn't know was that the meeting had succeeded perfectly, because tonight I had finally seen the entire plan operating in the open. And upstairs, inside a locked briefcase hidden beneath my desk, waited the one thing capable of destroying every person who had just sat around that table. The next morning, at exactly 8:17 a.m., a black Rolls-Royce pulled into my driveway, and when Brandon accidentally saw who stepped out of the back seat, the color drained completely from his face. I barely slept after the meeting, not because I was afraid. Fear had left me months ago. What kept me awake was grief, real grief. The kind people feel when they finally accept that something they loved is already gone. Around 2 in the morning, I walked into the spare bedroom where Eleanor kept old photo albums. The house was silent. For nearly 50 years, silence in that house had felt peaceful. That night, it felt like standing inside a grave. I sat on the floor and opened the first album. There was Eleanor at 23, smiling in a white dress on our wedding day. There was Brandon, as a little boy, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. There was Vanessa holding my hand on her first day of school. I turned page after page, remembering birthdays, Christmas mornings, vacations, scraped knees, graduation ceremonies, and all the ordinary moments that actually make up a life. Then I found a photograph taken 31 years earlier. Brandon was 7 years old. He had just fallen off his bicycle. His knee was bleeding, and he was crying. In the picture, I was kneeling beside him, holding the bike steady while teaching him how to get back up. I stared at that photograph for a long time. Somewhere between that moment and the man sitting across from me at the dining room table, something had broken. Maybe it was greed. Maybe it was entitlement. Maybe it was years of listening to the wrong people. I would probably never know. For the first time since this nightmare began, tears filled my eyes. Not because they betrayed me, because I finally understood they had already been gone for years. I was simply the last person to notice. Around sunrise, I closed the album and returned it to the shelf. Then I walked into my study and unlocked a small safe hidden behind a bookshelf. Inside were documents, keys, sealed envelopes, and a phone that almost nobody knew existed. I stared at everything for several seconds before closing the safe again. Not yet. There was still one final lesson my family needed to learn. At 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I already knew who it would be. Brandon, right on schedule. I opened the door and found him standing there with the same expensive briefcase from the night before. He looked tired, frustrated, impatient. The look of a man who had spent all night wondering why his plan hadn't worked. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. He entered and immediately started talking. No small talk. No pretending this was a social visit. "Dad, we need to finish the conversation." I nodded. "Do we?" "Yes." His voice was sharper than usual. "Last night got emotional. Emotional. Funny how the people trying to erase my life kept accusing me of being emotional." Brandon followed me into the kitchen. "Look, nobody wants a fight." Another lie. "Then stop fighting me." His jaw tightened. "We're trying to help." "You've said that before." He sighed heavily. "Dad, why are you making this so difficult?" I looked at him quietly. "Why are you?" For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Brandon made the mistake I had been waiting for. He stopped pretending. "Because this can't keep going." There it was. Not concern. Not love. Not worry. Impatience. Pure impatience. He wanted the process completed. He wanted access. He wanted control. I walked to the hallway closet and removed a small brass key hanging on a hook. Then I returned and placed it on the kitchen table between us. Brandon frowned. "What's that?" "The house key." His expression changed. "What?" I slid it toward him. "If the house matters more than I do, you can have it." Silence. Absolute silence. For the first time in months, Brandon looked completely unprepared. "What are you talking about?" "You want the house." I shrugged. "Take it." "Dad, you want the property, the accounts, the authority, the decisions." "Take all of it." Brandon stared at me as though I had started speaking another language. Because greed understands resistance. It doesn't understand surrender. This isn't funny. I'm not joking. I stood and walked toward the staircase. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Out." "Out where?" I smiled slightly. "Somewhere you don't control." Then I carried a small overnight bag downstairs. Brandon watched in confusion. He expected arguments. He expected signatures. He expected negotiations. What he did not expect was for me to leave. By the time Eleanor rushed into the kitchen after hearing raised voices, I was already standing near the front door. Vanessa arrived minutes later after Brandon called her. Nobody looked concerned. Nobody looked heartbroken. They looked nervous. Not because they might lose me, because they might lose the plan. "Theodore, stop this," Eleanor said. "Stop what?" "You're acting irrationally." I almost laughed. The woman who had spent months trying to convince people I was irrational was now upset because I wasn't following her script. I picked up my bag. "Goodbye, Eleanor." Her eyes widened slightly. Not from sadness, from shock. She had never expected me to walk away first. I opened the front door and stepped outside. The morning air felt cool against my face. Behind me, nobody followed. Nobody asked me to stay. Nobody said they loved me. The silence told me everything. I walked down the driveway carrying a single bag and 48 years of memories. Halfway to the street, I heard Brandon's voice behind me. "Dad!" I turned. He was standing near the garage. "You'll regret this." I looked at him for a long moment. "No, Brandon." Then I continued walking. When I reached the end of the street, something happened that stopped everyone behind me cold. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom turned the corner and slowly approached. The vehicle gleamed under the morning sunlight like something from another world. It came to a smooth stop directly beside me. A uniformed chauffeur stepped out immediately and opened the rear passenger door. Then, in a voice loud enough for Brandon, Eleanor, and Vanessa to hear from the driveway, he said, "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker. The board is waiting for you, Mr. Chairman." I watched the color drain from Brandon's face. Eleanor looked confused. Vanessa looked stunned. None of them understood what they had just heard. Not yet. I placed my bag inside the car and climbed into the back seat. As the door closed, my private phone began ringing. I answered. "Mr. Whitaker," the voice on the other end said. "All directors have arrived. They're waiting for your decision." I looked through the tinted window one last time at the family standing frozen in my driveway. Then I smiled for the first time in months. "Tell them," I said quietly. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." The silence inside the Rolls-Royce felt completely different from the silence I had left behind. One was filled with betrayal. The other was filled with purpose. As the car pulled away from the neighborhood, I watched my house disappear in the distance through the rear window. For nearly 50 years, that place had been my home. Yet for the first time in months, I felt lighter with every mile between us. My private phone rang again before we reached downtown. This time it was Catherine. "How did they react?" she asked. I almost smiled. Brandon looked like he had seen a ghost. Catherine laughed softly. "Good. They're about to see much worse." 20 minutes later, the Rolls-Royce stopped in front of a 48-story glass tower overlooking the Chicago skyline. People hurried through the revolving doors carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Most never looked up. They had no idea that the man stepping out of the back seat owned a controlling interest in the corporation occupying the top 20 floors. The chauffeur opened my door. "Welcome back, Mr. Whitaker." Back. The word felt appropriate, because for 12 years I had hidden in plain sight. 12 years pretending to be less than I was. 12 years watching who loved me and who loved what I owned. The lobby fell silent the moment I entered. Employees nodded respectfully. Security guards straightened their posture. Executives crossing the marble floor immediately stepped aside. None of them saw an old man. They saw the founder, the chairman, the person whose signature could change the future of the company before lunchtime. The elevator carried me directly to the executive level. When the doors opened, Catherine was waiting. So were 6 board members and 3 senior executives. Every one of them stood when I entered the conference room. "Good morning, Mr. Chairman," they said almost in unison. I sat at the head of the table and looked around. Some of these people had worked beside me for decades. Others had joined more recently. Every one of them knew the truth my family had never bothered to learn. I wasn't a retired old man surviving on memories. I was Theodore Whitaker, founder of Whitaker International, a corporation valued in the billions with interests across finance, logistics, healthcare, and commercial real estate. Catherine placed several folders in front of me. "Everything is prepared." I opened the first folder. Inside were reports regarding Damian Mercer. For months, investigators hired through private channels had quietly reviewed every business venture connected to him. What they found was impressive in all the wrong ways. Questionable partnerships, hidden liabilities, inflated valuations, shell companies, manipulated contracts, technically legal in some places, potentially criminal in others. Damian had spent years building a house of cards while convincing the world it was a castle. One board member leaned forward. "The exposure is significant." Another nodded. "His primary lenders are already nervous." Catherine slid another report toward me. "This arrived this morning. I reviewed the document carefully. Then I looked up. He leveraged that much?" "More." Her expression remained calm. "Most of his current expansion depends on credit lines tied to reputation and investor confidence." I closed the folder slowly. Damian Mercer had spent months planning to steal my future. The irony was that his own future was balanced on borrowed money. What happens if confidence disappears? I asked. The chief financial officer answered immediately. Everything starts collapsing. The room became quiet. Nobody needed further explanation. Large empires rarely die from direct attacks. Most die when confidence evaporates. Investors leave. Banks panic. Partners retreat. The structure falls under its own weight. I looked toward the skyline outside the conference room windows. Somewhere out there, Damian was probably celebrating what he believed was an approaching victory. He had no idea that his financial oxygen supply was already being measured. Catherine opened another folder. This one concerned Brandon. We completed the review you requested. I felt no pleasure hearing my son's name, only sadness. And? Catherine slid several pages across the table. Brandon has personally guaranteed loans connected to 3 of Damian's ventures. I stared at the documents. There it was. The final confirmation. Brandon hadn't simply admired Damian. He had tied his future to him. If Damian fell, Brandon would fall with him. One board member frowned. That's reckless. Another shook his head. It's worse than reckless. They were right. It was desperation disguised as ambition. Brandon wanted wealth so badly that he attached himself to the first man who promised it. Then came the report that surprised me most. Vanessa. Unlike Brandon, she wasn't deeply involved financially, but she had signed several witness statements supporting the narrative that my mental condition had deteriorated. Reading those documents hurt more than I expected. Brandon had chosen greed. Damian had chosen manipulation. Eleanor had chosen betrayal. Vanessa had chosen convenience. Sometimes that hurts just as much. Catherine closed the final folder. What are your instructions? Every person at the table looked toward me. For years, they had watched me build companies, negotiate acquisitions, and solve crises. Today, they expected another business decision. What they received instead was something personal. No illegal actions, I said. None. Heads nodded around the room. No revenge disguised as business. More nods. We use facts, contracts, audits, truth. Catherine smiled slightly. She already knew that would be my answer. Then I made the decision that changed everything. Begin immediate compliance reviews involving every Mercer-controlled company connected to our network. The chief legal officer made a note. Done. Freeze negotiations on pending projects. Another note. Done. Suspend strategic partnerships until all financial disclosures are verified. More notes, more nods. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal, nothing emotional, just sunlight. Pure sunlight directed at every corner Damian preferred to keep hidden. Sometimes truth is more dangerous than any weapon. The meeting continued for another hour. By the time it ended, a chain reaction had already begun. Not because I attacked Damian, because I stopped protecting him from scrutiny. As I stood to leave, Catherine approached quietly. You realize what happens next? I nodded. He starts losing control. And your family? I looked toward the Chicago skyline again. Somewhere across the city, Brandon was probably still trying to understand why a chauffeur had called his father Mr. Chairman. They're about to discover something important. Catherine raised an eyebrow. What's that? I picked up my coat and smiled faintly. The difference between taking from a weak old man and trying to rob the man who built the entire game. Meanwhile, 60 miles away, Damian Mercer received an unexpected phone call from one of his largest investors. And before that conversation ended, the first crack appeared in the empire he thought was untouchable. 3 days after the board meeting, the first signs of panic began appearing. Not publicly, not yet. Men like Damian Mercer never panic in public. They panic behind closed doors while pretending everything is under control. One investor postponed a meeting. Another requested additional financial disclosures. A lender demanded clarification regarding several outstanding obligations. Individually, none of these problems looked serious. Together, they formed a storm, and Damian could feel it coming. According to reports from Catherine's team, he spent most of that week making phone calls, arranging emergency meetings, and assuring people that rumors of financial instability were exaggerated. The more he reassured them, the more nervous they became. Confidence works in strange ways. The moment someone starts desperately defending it, people begin wondering why. Meanwhile, My family was dealing with a different kind of crisis. Brandon had become obsessed with discovering who I really was. 2 days after seeing the Rolls-Royce, he hired a private investigator. 3 days later, the investigator abruptly withdrew from the assignment. 4 days later, Brandon tried again with someone else. The result was the same. Certain information remained protected behind layers of corporate privacy and legal agreements. The more Brandon searched, the less he understood. That uncertainty terrified him. Not because he cared about me, because uncertainty threatened money. On Friday afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Eleanor's name. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello, Eleanor." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. She sounded different, less confident. "Theodore, where are you?" I almost smiled. For months, she had been planning my removal. Now she suddenly wanted to know where I was. "Why?" I asked. "Because nobody knows where you've been." "I've been busy." Another silence. Then she asked the question she truly wanted answered. "Who are you?" There it was. Not "how are you?" Not "are you okay?" Who are you? I looked out the window of my office toward the Chicago skyline. "The same man I've always been." "Don't do that." Her voice sharpened. "People are saying things." "What things?" "Brandon heard something about a company." "Did he?" "Theodore." I interrupted gently. "You should ask Brandon why he's suddenly interested in my finances." The line went silent again. Then she hung up. No goodbye. No apology. No explanation. That evening, Catherine arrived at my office carrying a gold envelope. She placed it on the desk and smiled. Perfect timing. I looked at the seal. I immediately recognized it. The Whitaker International Foundation Annual Gala, one of the most prestigious charity events in Chicago. Politicians attended. Business leaders attended. Journalists attended. Celebrities attended. More than 1,200 guests were expected this year. "Everything ready?" I asked. Catherine nodded. Every single thing. The invitation list had already been finalized weeks earlier. Damian Mercer and Eleanor had accepted their invitations long before the current situation began. At the time, they believed they would be attending as respected members of Chicago's business community. Neither of them realized they were walking directly into the worst night of their lives. The following evening, reports began arriving from multiple sources. Damian's largest development project had lost financing. 2 investors withdrew. 1 partnership agreement was suspended pending review. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the cracks were spreading. Every hour brought new pressure. Yet somehow, Damian remained convinced he could talk his way out of it. Men like him always believe charm is stronger than consequences. 3 days later, gala night finally arrived. The ballroom occupied nearly an entire floor of Chicago's most exclusive hotel. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Live music echoed through the hall. Television crews moved between guests. Waiters carried silver trays filled with champagne. The room looked exactly like the kind of place Brandon had spent his life dreaming about entering. Around 7 o'clock, Eleanor arrived wearing a designer gown. Damian walked beside her. Brandon followed close behind. Vanessa arrived separately. Reports later confirmed something I already suspected. They looked confident. Nervous, but confident. They believed the recent business problems were temporary. They believed they still controlled the future. Most importantly, they believed I would not be there. Then the evening began. For nearly an hour, speeches, introductions, and charitable presentations proceeded exactly as planned. Damian relaxed. Eleanor relaxed. Brandon began networking with investors. Vanessa spoke with several guests. They were comfortable. Too comfortable. Finally, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and approached the microphone. The ballroom slowly grew quiet. More than 1,200 guests turned their attention forward. Cameras focused on the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced, "before tonight's main presentation, we would like to recognize a man whose vision has transformed countless lives across this country." I watched through a private video feed from another room in the hotel. Brandon looked confused. Damian barely paid attention. "For more than 4 decades," the host continued, "his leadership has shaped industries, funded hospitals, created scholarships, and supported thousands of families. Now people were listening carefully. Many of you know the company he built. Few truly know the man behind it." Damian slowly stopped smiling. Something about the introduction felt familiar. Please join me in welcoming the founder, chairman, and principal benefactor of Whitaker International. The ballroom erupted into applause before the name was even spoken. Then came the moment that changed everything. Mr. Theodore Whitaker. The room rose to its feet. Every camera turned toward the entrance. Every guest stood. Every executive applauded. And across the ballroom, 4 members of my family froze in absolute disbelief as the doors slowly opened and I stepped inside. For a few seconds after my name was announced, nobody moved. The applause continued rolling through the ballroom like thunder, but my eyes never left the same 4 people. Eleanor, Brandon, Vanessa, Damien. I watched disbelief spread across their faces in real time. Brandon looked as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. Vanessa's mouth slowly fell open. Eleanor's entire body seemed frozen. But Damien's reaction interested me most, because unlike the others, recognition had finally arrived. 25 years earlier, he had sat across from investigators while I approved the decision that ended his career. Back then, he never met the owner directly. He only saw photographs, corporate reports, internal records. But now, standing beneath the lights of the ballroom, surrounded by executives and board members, he finally understood why my face had felt familiar. He finally understood whose life he had spent months trying to steal. The applause continued as I walked toward the stage. More than 1,200 people stood to their feet. Governors, judges, CEOs, foundation directors, university presidents, journalists. Men and women my family had spent years admiring, and every one of them was applauding me. I reached the stage and shook hands with the master of ceremonies. Then I turned toward the audience. The applause lasted nearly another 30 seconds before the room finally settled. "Thank you," I said. "Please sit." Chairs moved across the ballroom. Conversations died. Cameras remained fixed on the stage. From where I stood, I could clearly see my family near the center of the room. Nobody at their table was speaking anymore. They were simply staring. "Many people think tonight is about charity," I began. "And in many ways it is. But charity starts with truth. Without truth, nothing we build lasts very long." Several guests nodded. Others listened carefully. I paused, not for dramatic effect, to let the words settle. For most of my life, I believed character revealed itself during hard times. Recently, I learned something different. Character reveals itself when people think nobody is watching. Across the ballroom, Brandon shifted in his chair. Eleanor looked down at the table. Damien stared directly at me. The confidence he carried earlier in the evening was gone. "For 12 years, I continued, I conducted a private experiment. A ripple of curiosity moved through the audience. I wanted to know whether people valued me for who I was, or for what they believed I possessed." Silence followed. Complete silence. Then I looked directly toward Damien's table. The results were educational. A few people laughed softly. My family didn't. Catherine appeared beside the stage and handed a folder to the master of ceremonies. The giant screens surrounding the ballroom suddenly illuminated. Photographs appeared, dates, documents, financial records, nothing confidential. Nothing illegal, only facts, pure facts. The first screen showed corporate records connected to Damien Mercer. The second displayed documented financial misconduct from years earlier. The third outlined ongoing compliance investigations involving several of his companies. Murmurs immediately spread through the room. Damien's face turned pale. He rose halfway from his chair. "What is this?" he demanded. Nobody answered. The screens continued changing. Another set of records appeared. Investor withdrawals, suspended financing, internal audits, public filings, information collected entirely through lawful means. Information that had already begun circulating among regulators and lenders. "Sit down, Damien," I said calmly. The room became even quieter. "You don't get to use my first name." His voice cracked slightly. "Fear does strange things to pride." I smiled faintly. "After everything you've done, I think I do." Several guests exchanged confused glances. Others were beginning to understand. Then came the second phase. The screens changed again. This time, the documents weren't about Damien. They were about me. Guardianship proposals, power of attorney drafts, facility intake forms, Sunrise Gardens senior living. Every page displayed dates and signatures. Every page showed exactly how a group of people had attempted to remove legal control from an elderly family member while claiming to act out of love. The ballroom erupted into whispers. Some guests stared at the screens. Others stared directly at Eleanor and Brandon. Their faces were becoming impossible to watch. Not because they were suffering, because they finally understood what public accountability feels like. Brandon stood abruptly. "This is insane." His voice echoed through the ballroom. "You don't know the whole story." I looked at him quietly. "Then tell them." Silence. Brandon opened his mouth, closed it, then looked toward Eleanor. She looked toward Damien. Damien looked toward the floor. Nobody volunteered to explain, because lies become much harder to tell when facts are projected onto 20-foot screens. Then came the final blow. Catherine handed me one last document. I didn't even need to read it. I already knew what it contained. "Earlier this week," I said, "independent physicians completed a comprehensive cognitive evaluation. The report appeared on every screen. Exceptional cognitive function. No evidence of impairment. No indication of dementia. No diminished capacity." The room exploded into conversation. Journalists immediately began typing. Cameras zoomed in. Several guests openly stared at Brandon and Eleanor in disbelief. The guardianship narrative had just died in front of 1,200 witnesses. Eleanor suddenly stood. "Theodore, please." For the first time all evening, her voice sounded frightened. Not embarrassed. Frightened. I looked at her. Really looked at her. 48 years of marriage, thousands of shared memories, countless sacrifices, all ending in this moment. "Please what?" I asked quietly. Tears appeared in her eyes. "Not like this." Those 3 words nearly broke my heart, because even now, she still didn't understand. This wasn't happening because of one speech, or one night, or one mistake. This was happening because of hundreds of choices made over years, choices she willingly made. "Not like this?" I repeated. "You selected my nursing home before asking whether I wanted one." The ballroom went silent again. Eleanor lowered her head. Brandon looked ready to collapse. Damien remained frozen. Then I delivered the sentence that ended everything. "The saddest part is that none of you lost me tonight." I paused. "You lost me years ago. Tonight, you simply discovered the consequences." At that exact moment, 3 men in dark suits entered the ballroom from a side entrance. One approached Damien directly. The entire room watched as he displayed official credentials. Damien's face lost what little color remained. The agent spoke quietly. Damien stopped breathing for a second. Then the agent said something everyone nearby could hear. "Mr. Mercer, we'd like to ask you a few questions regarding an ongoing federal investigation." And for the first time all evening, Damien Mercer looked truly afraid. 1 year later, I was standing in my backyard repairing the same fence where this story had begun. The wood was different. Some of the posts had been replaced, but the work felt familiar. The morning sun was warm. Birds moved through the trees beyond the property line, and for the first time in a very long time, peace no longer felt like something I had to pretend existed. It was real. People often imagine justice as a dramatic moment. A courtroom verdict. Handcuffs. Headlines. The truth is that justice usually arrives much more slowly. It arrives through consequences, through empty chairs, through phone calls that stop coming, through opportunities that disappear forever. Over the 12 months following the gala, every person involved in the plan to take my life apart discovered that actions create debts, and eventually, those debts come due. Damien Mercer learned that lesson first. Federal investigators spent months examining his business dealings. Once they started pulling threads, the entire sweater came apart. Investors who once praised him rushed to protect themselves. Partners abandoned projects. Lenders demanded answers he couldn't provide. The empire he spent years building collapsed faster than anyone expected because it had never been built on integrity. It had been built on appearance. By the time the legal proceedings ended, Damien faced multiple federal charges connected to fraud, financial misconduct, and obstruction. The man who once walked into my home believing he could steal my future eventually walked into a courtroom surrounded by attorneys and federal agents. The newspapers covered the story for weeks, but I never attended a single hearing. I didn't need to. My battle with Damien ended the moment the truth became public. Brandon's punishment turned out to be different, and in many ways, harder. He wasn't led away in handcuffs. He wasn't prosecuted. Instead, he was forced to live with the consequences of every choice he made. The financial ventures he tied himself to collapsed alongside Damien's businesses. The career opportunities he expected never arrived. Professional relationships disappeared. Calls stopped being returned. Invitations stopped coming. The people he thought were friends vanished the moment success vanished with them. One afternoon, nearly 8 months after the gala, Brandon requested a meeting. We met at a small diner outside town, the same kind of place where Gloria first handed me the documents that exposed the conspiracy. Time has a sense of humor. When Brandon walked through the door, I barely recognized him. He looked older, not physically, emotionally, like someone who had finally discovered that shortcuts often lead off cliffs. We sat across from one another in silence for almost a minute. Then he looked down at his coffee and said the words I once believed I would never hear. I was wrong. No excuses, no justifications, no explanations. Just 4 simple words. I nodded but didn't speak. Brandon swallowed hard. I kept telling myself I was helping Mom. Then I told myself I was protecting the family. Then I told myself everyone would be better off. He laughed bitterly. The truth is, I wanted what wasn't mine. I listened quietly. "Do you hate me?" he finally asked. It was an honest question. Maybe the first completely honest question he had asked in years. I thought about it carefully before answering. No. His eyes widened slightly. Why not? I looked out the window at the passing traffic. Because hate would mean you're still controlling part of my life. Tears appeared in his eyes. He tried to hide them and failed. For the first time since he was a child, I saw genuine shame on his face. Not fear of consequences, not fear of losing money. Shame. Real shame. We talked for another hour. When we finally stood to leave, Brandon hesitated. I don't expect forgiveness. I placed a hand on his shoulder. That's good. He looked confused. Why? Because forgiveness isn't something you ask for. I smiled sadly. It's something you earn. Then I walked away. Whether Brandon ever fully earns it remains a story for another day. Vanessa visited me 3 weeks later. Unlike Brandon, she didn't call first. She simply showed up at my front door carrying a box. Inside were old photographs, school drawings, Father's Day cards, and dozens of memories she had kept over the years. We sat on the porch together while the sun set. At one point, she started crying so hard she couldn't speak. Eventually, she managed to whisper. I knew something was wrong. I said nothing. She continued. I saw things. I heard things, and I kept convincing myself it wasn't my responsibility. She wiped tears from her face. I was a coward. Of everything she said that evening, that sentence hurt the most because it was true. Vanessa had not led the conspiracy. She had not created it, but she had stood beside it. Sometimes silence helps evil almost as much as participation does. I'm sorry, Dad. The words came out broken and shaky. I looked at my daughter for a long time before answering. I know. She cried harder after that. Not because I rejected her, because I didn't. Deep down, she knew she deserved anger. What she received instead was honesty, and honesty can be much harder to face. Eleanor never truly recovered from the collapse. Damien disappeared from her life through prison gates. The social circles she valued disappeared almost as quickly. The people who once admired her suddenly remembered appointments whenever she approached. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls stopped coming. For months, she tried blaming everyone else. Damien, Brandon, me, fate, anyone except herself. Then reality finally caught up. About 11 months after the gala, she asked to meet. We sat on a park bench overlooking the lake, where we once walked together when we were young. She looked older than I remembered. Regret does that. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked at the water and whispered, I threw away 48 years. There was nothing I could say to that. Because she was right. She turned toward me. Tears filled her eyes. If I could go back. I gently shook my head. You can't. More tears followed. I know. We sat there a little longer. Then I stood up. Eleanor looked frightened. Is this goodbye? I thought about the question. Then I answered honestly. No. Hope appeared in her eyes. For one brief second, she thought reconciliation might still be possible. Then I finished speaking. The goodbye happened a long time ago. We're just acknowledging it now. I walked away without looking back. Some endings aren't dramatic. They're simply final. The greatest surprise came from Charlotte. 6 months after leaving Brandon, she accepted an invitation to join the Theodore Whitaker Foundation. What started as a volunteer position eventually became something much larger. Charlotte helped create programs protecting elderly Americans from financial abuse, guardianship scams, and predatory manipulation. Hundreds of families received assistance during the first year alone, then thousands. The work mattered. It mattered because every person we helped represented someone who didn't have the resources, lawyers, or opportunities I had. One autumn afternoon, Charlotte stood beside me during the opening of a new community outreach center. Reporters asked why the foundation focused so heavily on elder protection. I looked at the crowd gathered outside the building and smiled. Because nobody should spend a lifetime building a life, only to have someone else try to steal it. The quote appeared in newspapers across the state the next morning. Today, as I finish repairing this fence, I sometimes think about the strange journey that brought me here. People often assume my greatest achievement was building a billion-dollar company. They are wrong. Companies can be sold, buildings can be replaced. Money changes hands every day. My greatest achievement was surviving betrayal without becoming the kind of person who betrayed me. The hammer in my hand feels familiar. The breeze feels familiar. The simple life I always loved still surrounds me. The difference is that now I understand something I once forgot. Wealth doesn't reveal character. Power doesn't reveal character. Success doesn't reveal character. Truth does. In the end, I didn't win because I was richer than the people who tried to destroy me. I won because when the truth finally arrived, I was the only one still standing beside it.